The hotel owner disguised himself to test his employees, but he was thrown out by the manager, and what happened next will leave you in shock. The midday sun beat down on the streets of Miami when John Davis walked slowly toward the imposing Ocean View Grand Hotel. His cautious steps echoed on the polished marble of the main entrance, where jets of water danced in ornate fountains and imperial palm trees swayed gently with the sea breeze. John Davis was a 62-year-old man with simply combed grey hair, wearing a faded shirt and ordinary cloth pants. His calloused hands held an old brown leather bag, worn by time and weather. His eyes, however, held a deep serenity, as if they guarded secrets the world had yet to discover. The hotel doorman, a tall and robust man named Bill Sahag, raised his hand with an authoritative gesture as soon as John Davis approached the revolving door of smoked glass. "Hey, wait, sir. Where do you think you're going?" John Davis stopped, adjusted the bag strap on his shoulder and replied in a serene voice, "Good afternoon. I have a reservation at this hotel." Bill let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. His eyes scanned John Davis from head to toe, stopping at his simple clothes and worn-out shoes. "A reservation? You? My friend, this is a 5-star hotel. The rooms cost more than you must make in a month." Other guests entering and leaving the hotel began to discreetly gather, watching the scene with curiosity. An elegant lady, adorned with jewelry, whispered to her husband, "What an embarrassing situation. Why do they let these types of people get close?" John Davis remained calm, took a deep breath and said, "I understand your concern, but I really do have a reservation. Could you please let me speak with the reception?" "Look at this situation." Bill turned to the other employees nearby. "The man insists he has a reservation. He must have mistaken this for some local hostel." Laughter echoed in the main lobby, mixing with the soft sound of a grand piano playing a tranquil melody. The contrast was striking. On one side, the elegance and sophistication of the environment. On the other, a man being publicly humiliated for his simple appearance. John Davis closed his eyes for a moment, as if he were saying a silent prayer. When he opened them again, there was a quiet determination that few knew how to interpret. "Please," he insisted, "just 5 minutes with the receptionist. That's all I ask." Bill snorted impatiently, but finally gave in, more to get rid of this uncomfortable situation than out of kindness. All right, but stay over there in the waiting area. And don't get near the real guests." As John Davis walked toward a chair in a corner of the lobby, a young receptionist watched everything from behind the marble counter. Natalie Peterson, 28, with artificially blonde hair and a permanently plastered-on commercial smile, had already decided how she would treat this intruder. But what John Davis didn't know was that in a few hours, that very hotel would become the stage for the biggest surprise of their lives. Natalie Peterson watched John Davis sit awkwardly on the lobby armchair, as if he were desecrating a sacred environment. Her fingers drummed impatiently on the reception counter as she mentally calculated how long it would take to get rid of this problem. "Good morning, sir," she said, approaching with a fake smile that couldn't hide her disdain. "How can I help you?" The pause before the word help was on purpose, loaded with sarcasm that didn't go unnoticed by the other nearby employees. John Davis stood up respectfully, approached the counter, and opened his old bag. "Good morning, miss. I have a reservation for today. The name is John Davis." Natalie typed the name into the computer with exaggeratedly slow movements, as if she were doing a monumental favor. After a few seconds, she theatrically frowned. "How strange. I can't find any reservation with that name. Are you sure it's at this hotel? Because, you see," she gestured grandly toward the luxurious surroundings. "This is the Ocean View Grand Hotel, 5-star international. Perhaps you're confusing it with some more suitable establishment." The word suitable came out of her mouth as if it were venomous. Some nearby guests began to whisper among themselves, creating an uncomfortable murmur. John Davis remained impassive, pulling a yellowed envelope from his bag. "I understand your surprise. Could you please call the manager? I have some documents that can clarify the situation." Natalie dramatically rolled her eyes. "Mr. Chuck Gibson is a very busy man. He cannot be bothered with these minor issues. Why don't you look for a hotel that's more within your reach?" It was then that Jake Miller, a 24-year-old with a bellboy uniform, approached the reception. He had curly hair, kind eyes, and an expression of genuine concern on his face. "Excuse me, Ms. Natalie," he said respectfully. "I've noticed that the gentleman is having some difficulties. Can I help with anything?" Natalie glared at him. "Jake, don't you have anything better to do? Go back to your deliveries." But Jake wasn't intimidated. He approached John Davis with sincerity. "Sir, my name is Jake. If you really have a reservation, I can help you resolve this situation. Everyone deserves to be treated with respect, no matter how they are dressed." John Davis smiled for the first time since he had arrived at the hotel. It was a sad smile, but full of gratitude. "Thank you, young man. You are very kind. Could you please speak with Mr. Chuck Gibson? It would be very important." Jake nodded and headed to the internal phone. He dialed the manager's extension and waited. "Hello, Mr. Chuck. There's a gentleman here at reception who would like to speak with you. Yes, he says he has a reservation. No, sir, Natalie hasn't found it in the system." Chuck Gibson's voice exploded from the phone, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Jake, I don't have time to waste with beggars. Tell that old man to leave immediately. And you, Natalie, stop paying attention to just anyone who shows up." The silence that followed was deafening. John Davis closed his eyes again, took a deep breath, and put the envelope back in his bag. "Thank you for your kindness, young Jake. You have a good heart. That is rarer than you can imagine." As John Davis headed back to the waiting area, Jake watched Natalie resume her arrogant posture, as if nothing had happened. But what none of them knew was that inside that simple envelope was the document that would forever change the hierarchy of that hotel. An hour passed. John Davis remained seated patiently on the lobby armchair, observing the incessant movement of the hotel. Rushed executives crossed the polished marble with branded briefcases, wealthy families laughed loudly while planning visits to Miami's tourist spots, and elegant couples headed to the panoramic restaurant. The contrast was striking. While everyone was greeted with bows and warm smiles, John Davis was systematically ignored, as if he were part of the decor. Jake watched it all from a distance, feeling a growing weight in his chest. With each passing minute, his indignation increased. During a break in his activities, he approached John Davis again. "Sir, do you have family? Anyone who can help you with this situation?" John Davis looked up, and Jake could perceive a deep melancholy in his eyes. "Yes, young Jake. But sometimes it's important for people to show who they really are, don't you think? Adversity reveals a person's true character." "But this isn't right. They're treating you as if I were an inferior human being," John Davis completed gently. "Well, yes, young man. Unfortunately, this type of treatment is more common than you imagine." Natalie, who had overheard part of the conversation, approached with an air of superiority. "Look, Mr. Davis, right? It's been over an hour now. Don't you think it's time to look for a place that's more compatible with your situation?" John Davis slowly stood up, adjusted his wrinkled shirt, and looked directly into Natalie's eyes. "Miss, could you do me one last favor? I would really like to personally hand some documents to Mr. Chuck Gibson. It's a very important matter for me." "Documents?" Natalie let out a sarcastic laugh. "What kind of documents could you have that would interest our manager?" "Documents related to this hotel." John Davis's simple answer created an awkward moment of silence. Jake frowned, curious, while Natalie hesitated for a few seconds. "All right," she finally said, "but it will be very quick. Mr. Chuck is a very busy man." John Davis followed Natalie across the lobby toward the executive elevators. Jake watched them walk away, with a strange premonition growing in his chest. On the 15th floor, Chuck Gibson's office was a monument to ostentation: panoramic windows with views of Miami Beach, noble wood furniture, expensive paintings, and a glass desk the size of a dining table. Chuck Gibson, a 42-year-old man with slicked back hair and an imported suit, didn't even look up from his papers when John Davis entered. "Natalie said you have some documents to show me. Make it quick. I have an important meeting in 10 minutes. John Davis approached the desk and respectfully placed the yellowed envelope on the glass. "Mr. Chuck Gibson, these documents are very important. I would like you to examine them carefully." Chuck finally looked up, sweeping John Davis with a look of absolute contempt, and without even touching the envelope, pushed it to the side of the desk. "Listen to me, old man. I don't know what game you're playing, but I don't have time for this. It's obvious you don't even have the money to pay for a night here. What kind of document could you have that would interest me?" John Davis remained standing, serene, observing Chuck Gibson with an expression that mixed sadness and something deeper. "Mr. Chuck, sometimes appearances can be very deceiving. I only ask that you open that envelope and read what's inside. You know what I think?" Chuck stood up abruptly, walked around the desk, and stood face to face with John Davis. "I think you're another one of those scammers who show up at luxury hotels trying to pull some trick. Well, it doesn't work with me." Chuck picked up the envelope and threw it into the trash can next to the desk. Now get out of my office before I call security. John Davis watched his envelope disappear into the trash can, and for a moment, his shoulders seemed to slump. When he looked back up at Chuck Gibson, there was an unshakable determination in his eyes. Very well, Mr. Chuck Gibson. You will have the opportunity to reflect on your choices. Goodbye. After John Davis left, Chuck Gibson returned to his chair, muttering words of irritation. He didn't even notice when Jake knocked on the door 20 minutes later. Mr. Chuck, I've come to pick up the documents you didn't want to see. Jake, how many times do I have to tell you I'm busy? Sir, it's about that man, John Davis. He is... If you mention that old man one more time, you're fired. Fired. Do you understand? The threat silenced Jake immediately. He stood outside the door, holding the documents, knowing that a storm was approaching and that nothing could stop it. Jake stood in the service hallway for long minutes, rereading the documents 1, 2, 3 times. His hands trembled as his eyes scanned every line, every stamp, every signature. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. On the first page it was written, Deed of Property, Ocean View Grand Hotel, Owner, John Davis, Shareholding, 65%. Jake stood in the service hallway for long minutes, rereading the documents 1, 2, 3 times. His hands trembled as his eyes scanned every line, every stamp, every signature. He couldn't be seeing this. John Davis wasn't a beggar. John Davis wasn't a scammer. John Davis was the owner of the hotel. "Oh my God!" he whispered, leaning against the wall so he wouldn't faint. What have we done? The documents were unequivocal. Updated certificates, notary records, proofs of multi-million-dollar bank transfers, all sealed and authenticated. John Davis owned 65% of the shares of the Ocean View Grand Hotel, which made him the majority owner, and technically the boss of everyone there, including Chuck Gibson. Jake ran back to the managerial office, knocking on the door desperately. Mr. Chuck, please, I need to talk to you urgently. Jake, how many times must I tell you I'm busy? Sir, it's about that man. John Davis. He is... If you mention that old man one more time, you're fired. Fired. Do you understand? The threat silenced Jake immediately. He stood outside the door, holding the documents, knowing that a storm was approaching and that nothing could stop it. That night, Jake could barely sleep. He tossed and turned in bed, imagining the consequences of what he had witnessed. John Davis had been humiliated, disrespected, and practically expelled from his own hotel. How many times had this happened before? How many other people had been judged by their appearance? The next morning, the atmosphere in the hotel was different. Employees whispered in the hallways, mysterious calls were answered at the reception, and an inexplicable tension hung in the air. At exactly 10:30 a.m., the hotel's revolving doors opened. John Davis entered the lobby again, but this time he wasn't alone. Walking beside him was a tall man in an impeccable suit with an executive briefcase. Dr. Henry Anderson, a lawyer specializing in commercial law, politely greeted the doorman Bill. "Good morning. We are expected by Mr. Chuck Gibson." The transformation in John Davis's posture was subtle but noticeable. He no longer walked with hunched shoulders. His posture was straight, confident. His clothes were still simple, but there was a natural authority in his movements that wasn't present the day before. Natalie, behind the reception counter, widened her eyes as she recognized John Davis. But what is he doing here again? Dr. Henry approached the counter with a professional smile. "Good morning, miss. I am Dr. Henry Anderson, lawyer for Mr. John Davis. We would like to speak with the manager, Chuck Gibson. It's an urgent matter related to the administration of this hotel." The words "administration of this hotel" echoed in the lobby like a bomb. Curious guests began to discreetly approach. Employees stopped their activities, and a growing murmur took over the environment. Natalie, visibly nervous, dialed Chuck Gibson's extension. "Mr. Chuck, it's Mr. John Davis here again, but now he has a lawyer with him." Chuck Gibson's response was so loud that everyone could hear it. "A lawyer? What kind of farce is that? Send them away immediately!" Doctor Henry, maintaining his professional composure, handed a business card to Natalie. "Please inform Mr. Chuck Gibson that if he does not receive us in 5 minutes, we will take the appropriate administrative measures. This is a matter of business ownership and management." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the pianist stopped playing. Jake, who was watching it all from a distance, felt his heart race. It was like watching a suspense movie, knowing the ending, but unable to warn the other characters about what was to come. 3 minutes later, the elevator opened, and Chuck Gibson came out like a hurricane, his face red with anger, and his suit wrinkled from the rush. "What's this story about ownership and management? Who do you think you are, coming to my hotel and making threats?" John Davis stepped forward, looked directly into Chuck Gibson's eyes, and, with a calm voice full of authority, said, "Mr. Chuck Gibson, my name is John Davis. I am the majority owner of this hotel. Yesterday you had the opportunity to know me properly, but you chose to judge me by my appearance. Today I have come to formalize some administrative changes." What happened next forever changed the lives of everyone present in that lobby. The lobby of the Ocean View Grand Hotel had never experienced such a deep silence. It was as if time had stopped, as if even the Miami Sea had ceased its movement out there. Chuck Gibson was left speechless for long seconds, processing what he had just heard. His face went through a sequence of expressions: disbelief, confusion, despair, and finally panic. This is ridiculous," he stammered, his voice losing all previous authority. You're lying. It's impossible. You are... Am I what, Mr. Chuck?" John Davis asked calmly. "Too poor to own a five-star hotel? Too simple to deserve respect? Too poorly dressed to have credibility?" Dr. Henry opened his executive briefcase and took out a voluminous folder. "Mr. Chuck Gibson, here are all the updated certificates, property records, proof of shareholding, and founding documents of this hotel. Mr. John Davis is legally the majority owner of this property with 65% of the shares." Chuck Gibson tried to grab the documents with trembling hands, but they fell from his fingers like dry leaves. Natalie approached to help him, equally stunned. "It can't be," she murmured. "Yesterday I treated him like he was—" "As if I were a beggar?" John Davis completed gently. "Exactly as you treated me, Miss Natalie, and as Mr. Chuck Gibson treated me when he threw my documents in the trash." The crowd of guests and employees that had formed around the scene began to murmur in shock. Some people discreetly took photos. Others commented in hushed tones about the dramatic turn. Jake, still at the back of the lobby, felt his eyes fill with tears. They were not tears of sadness, but of a deep satisfaction in seeing that justice was finally being served. Dr. Henry took the floor. "Mr. Chuck Gibson, considering the events of yesterday, the public humiliation, the lack of respect, the discrimination based on appearance, and the refusal to properly assist the owner of the establishment, Mr. John Davis has made some administrative decisions." Chuck Gibson swallowed hard, already anticipating the worst. "First decision," the lawyer continued, "the gentleman is relieved of the position of general manager, effective immediately." The impact of the phrase echoed in the lobby like an explosion. Chuck Gibson staggered, leaning on the reception counter. "No, you can't do this to me. I've been here for 8 years. I built the reputation of this place." John Davis approached him, and for the first time, there was a severe firmness in his voice. "Mr. Chuck, you built a reputation based on disrespect and discrimination. Yesterday, when I was dressed simply, you treated me like garbage. Today, knowing who I am, you would surely treat me like a king. That is not hotel management. That is prejudice." "Second decision," Dr. Henry continued, "considering that the gentleman needs to learn firsthand what it's like to be treated with disrespect, he will be reassigned to the role of bellboy and general services. He will receive a salary compatible with that function." The humiliation was complete. Chuck Gibson, who 5 minutes ago commanded the hotel like an emperor, was now being demoted to the most basic position in the hierarchy. "And the third decision," John Davis spoke again, "the young man Jake Miller will be promoted to the position of general manager." All heads turned to the back of the lobby, where Jake stood motionless, unable to believe what he was hearing. "Me?" he cried involuntarily. "But Mr. John, I'm just a bellboy. I don't have the experience to—" John Davis walked toward Jake, passing through the crowd that respectfully parted. "Young Jake, yesterday, when everyone humiliated me, you were the only person who treated me with dignity. You offered help, showed genuine concern, and tried to resolve my situation. That is worth more than any hotel management course." John Davis put his hand on Jake's shoulder. "The true qualification to lead people is humanity, and you, young man, have humanity to spare." But the surprises of that morning were not over. John Davis still had one last statement that would forever change the philosophy of that hotel. Jake remained paralyzed for long minutes, trying to assimilate the magnitude of what was happening. From bellboy to general manager in a matter of seconds, it was like living a dream, or, considering the context, waking up from a nightmare. "Mr. John," he said with a broken voice, I don't know what to say. Yesterday you were exactly what you are today, a decent person, John Davis interrupted with a paternal smile. The difference is that today that decency will be recognized and rewarded. Chuck Gibson, still in shock, tried one last move. This can't be happening. I'll sue. I'll challenge it. There's a hierarchy. There are procedures. You can't just fire a manager like that. Doctor, Henry smiled coldly and pulled another document from the briefcase. Actually, Mr. Chuck, you can. As the majority owner, Mr. John Davis has full authority over hiring and firing, and considering that yesterday you literally threw away legal documents without even examining them, that constitutes gross administrative negligence. John Davis approached Chuck Gibson, who now seemed to have aged 10 years in 10 minutes. Mr. Chuck, I am not a vindictive person. I could fire you completely, but I believe in the possibility of redemption. In the role of a bellboy, you will have the opportunity to learn what it's like to be at the bottom of the hierarchy, what it's like to be treated without respect for social position. The irony of the situation did not go unnoticed by anyone. The man who yesterday humiliated John Davis for his simple appearance would now be forced to work in an even more humble position. Natalie, realizing she might be next in the line of fire, approached nervously. Mr. John, I want to apologize for what happened yesterday. I didn't know you were... John Davis raised his hand gently, interrupting her. Miss Natalie, that is exactly the point. You didn't respect me because you didn't know who I was, but all human beings deserve basic respect, regardless of their social position or appearance. Natalie lowered her head, genuinely ashamed. You're right. I've acted this way for so long that I don't even realize it anymore. Can I continue to work here? John Davis weighed the question for a few seconds. Yes, Miss Natalie, but with one condition. From today on, all guests and visitors will be treated with the same courtesy, no matter how they are dressed or what their financial condition seems to be. Can you do that? Yes, sir. I promise. John Davis then turned to the crowd that had formed in the lobby. Guests, employees, curious onlookers who had stopped to witness the drama. His voice resonated clear and strong. Ladies and gentlemen, employees of this hotel, I want to make an official announcement. From today on, the Ocean View Grand Hotel will have a new operating philosophy. All conversations ceased. It was as if John Davis had an invisible microphone, amplifying his voice throughout the environment. This hotel will no longer be a place where people are judged by their appearance, by the clothes they wear, or by the brand of their bags. It will be a place where humanity will be valued above all else. Murmurs of approval began to circulate among those present. I want all employees to understand, our job is not to flatter the rich and despise the poor. Our job is to offer excellence in service to every human being who crosses our door. Jake, still trying to adapt to the new reality, stepped forward. Mr. John, as the new manager, what specific measures would you like me to implement? John Davis smiled, satisfied with Jake's proactivity. First measure, mandatory training for all employees on respect and humanized service. Second measure, any employee caught discriminating against people based on their appearance will be immediately fired. Third measure, we will implement a social responsibility program where people in vulnerable situations can have access to our basic services. The crowd began to applaud spontaneously. Even some guests who had witnessed John Davis's humiliation the day before seemed genuinely moved by the transformation. John Davis raised his hands, asking for silence. And I want to leave a final message for all of you. What John Davis said next would become the hotel's motto and forever change the way people thought about wealth, respect, and human dignity. John Davis walked slowly to the center of the lobby, his steps echoing on the polished marble. All those present, employees, guests, curious onlookers, formed a semicircle around him, as if they were participating in a historic ceremony. When he spoke, his voice carried decades of experience and wisdom. I want to tell you a story. 30 years ago, I was a young man living in the Flats neighborhood. I worked loading sacks of cement on construction sites all over the city. My clothes were always dirty, my hands were always calloused, and people looked at me exactly as you looked at me yesterday. A respectful silence took over the environment. John Davis continued, One day a wealthy businessman gave me an opportunity, not because I was well dressed or because I had money, but because he saw something in me that others couldn't see. Potential, dedication, character. Jake listened to every word with redoubled attention, realizing he was witnessing a life lesson. That businessman taught me that there are two types of wealth in this world. The first is material wealth, money, property, cars, jewelry. That wealth can be lost in a crisis, stolen by thieves or wasted in bad investments. John Davis paused, observing the attentive faces around him. But there is a second, much more valuable wealth, the wealth of character, of dignity, of respect for others. No one can steal that wealth from you, and it is that wealth that builds true empires. Chuck Gibson, still in shock from his fall, listened from a distance, beginning to understand the magnitude of his errors. Today I own hotels in 3 states, construction companies, real estate investments. But do you know where I learned the principles that brought me here? Loading cement in the flats. There I learned that all honest work has value. There I learned that treating people well costs nothing and is worth everything. An elegant lady, who the day before had made prejudiced comments, approached with tears in her eyes. Mr. John, I want to apologize for the horrible things I thought yesterday. You are making me re-evaluate many things about myself. John Davis nodded gently. Ma'am, we all have prejudices. The difference is in recognizing them and working to change them. Jake, finally finding the courage to speak, approached. Mr. John, how can I be a good manager? I don't have administrative experience. I didn't study hotel management. John Davis put his hand on the young man's shoulder. Jake, you have the most important quality a leader can have: empathy. Yesterday, when everyone ignored me, you cared about my well-being. That is worth more than 1,000 diplomas. Dr. Henry, who had observed the entire scene in silence, approached with some papers. Mr. John, you need to sign the administrative transfer documents and the new organizational structure of the hotel. Of course, Dr. Henry. But first, I want to make a few more adjustments. John Davis turned to Natalie. Miss Natalie, from today on, you will be promoted to customer service supervisor. Your mission will be to ensure that no guest or visitor is ever disrespected in this hotel. Natalie's eyes widened in disbelief. Mr. John, but I treated you so badly yesterday. Exactly. Someone who has made a mistake and sincerely repented is less likely to repeat it. You will be my guarantee that this will never happen again. Then John Davis addressed Bill, the doorman who had been the first to humiliate him. Mr. Bill, you will also receive special training on reception and hospitality. I want you to understand that your role is not to be a guard to scare people away, but to be an ambassador, representing the hospitality of this hotel. Bill, visibly moved, nodded. Yes, Mr. John, I promise it will be different. John Davis then turned to the crowd one last time. And now I leave you with the philosophy that will guide this hotel from now on. True wealth is not in the money we have, but in the way we treat people. Engrave this in your minds and in your hearts. But the most impressive transformation was yet to come. Chuck Gibson, humiliated and demoted, was about to have an experience that would forever change his perspective on life. 3 days had passed since the revelation that transformed the Ocean View Grand Hotel. Chuck Gibson, who for 8 years had commanded the establishment like a small emperor, now walked through the service hallways, wearing the navy blue uniform of the bellboys. His hands, once well kept and perfumed, now carried heavy trays, documents for delivery, and guests' luggage. His Italian leather shoes had been replaced by uncomfortable safety shoes that caused blisters on his feet. On the morning of the 3rd day, Chuck Gibson was organizing correspondence in the basement when Natalie came down to find him. Mr. Chuck Gibson, there's an urgent delivery on the 12th floor. The hierarchical inversion was evident. Natalie, who used to take his orders, now supervised his work. The discomfort was mutual and palpable. What kind of delivery? Chuck Gibson asked, trying to maintain some vestige of dignity. A family with 3 small children. They need extra cribs and special amenities. Chuck Gibson slowly went up to the 12th floor, carrying heavy equipment. At each floor, his legs protested, and his breathing became more labored. He had never realized how big the hotel was when seen from the bottom up. Upon reaching room 1247, he rang the doorbell respectfully. Room service. The door opened, and a young woman appeared, holding a baby in her arms. Behind her, 2 small children ran around the room, clearly tired from the trip. Oh, good. We were waiting for the cribs. The kids are exhausted. Chuck Gibson entered the room and began to assemble the portable cribs. During the task, one of the children, a boy about 4 years old, approached with curiosity. Do you work here at the hotel? Yes, I work, Chuck Gibson replied, not knowing quite how to explain his situation. My mommy says everyone who works at hotels is very kind. Is that true? The child's innocent question hit Chuck Gibson like a punch to the stomach. He remembered how many times he had been rude to employees in lower hierarchical levels, how many times he had mistreated people who, like him now, were just trying to do their job. I hope so, he replied in a low voice. After finishing the assembly, the woman wanted to give him a tip. "Thanks for the help. Here, this is for you." Chuck Gibson looked at the bills and, for the first time in years, understood what it meant to depend on tips to supplement one's salary. Those few dollars, which he wouldn't have even noticed before, now represented a significant part of his monthly income. "Thank you very much, ma'am." In the elevator, heading back to the basement, Chuck Gibson observed his reflection in the mirror. The man looking back had disheveled hair, a sweaty uniform and a tired expression on his face. It was like looking at a stranger. When he reached the ground floor, he ran into Jake, who now occupied his former office on the 15th floor. "Chuck Gibson, how are you adapting?" Jake asked with genuine concern. It was surreal. The young man who 3 days ago took his orders now spoke to him as an equal without arrogance, but with the authority of someone who had been promoted. "It's different," Chuck Gibson admitted. "I can imagine. It must be a big shock." Chuck Gibson hesitated for a moment, then asked, "Jake, can I ask you a question? How do you manage to treat even those who treated you badly with kindness?" Jake smiled sadly. "Because I know what it's like to be at the bottom, Chuck Gibson. I know what it's like to be invisible, to be ignored, to be treated as if you're not important. And when someone is going through that, even if it's someone who hurt me, I can't be cruel." Jake's response resonated in Chuck Gibson's mind for the rest of the day, as he organized documents, cleaned lounges, and attended to guests' requests. He began to notice details that had previously gone unnoticed. He noticed how some employees were treated harshly by arrogant guests. He observed how certain people made impossible requests and expected to be attended to immediately. He saw how some customers didn't even look into the eyes of those who served them. At the end of the third day, exhausted and with a body full of aches, Chuck Gibson sat in the employee's locker room. Next to him, Bill was changing out of his clothes after his shift. "Bill," Chuck Gibson said in a broken voice, "can I ask you something?" "Sure. How did you put up with being treated the way I treated you for all these years?" Bill stopped changing and looked directly at Chuck Gibson. "Because I needed the job. I have 3 kids to support. But I'll tell you one thing, every night I went home thinking if it wouldn't be better to look for another place to work." Bill's response was like an awakening for Chuck Gibson. For the first time, he began to understand that his actions had real consequences on the lives of real people. A week had passed since Chuck Gibson's downfall. The hotel operated with a different harmony, more humane, more respectful. Jake had adapted surprisingly well to the manager position, demonstrating a natural leadership based on empathy and common sense. John Davis made regular visits to the hotel, always dressed simply, observing the implemented changes. On that Thursday afternoon, he found Chuck Gibson cleaning the windows of the main lobby. "How are you feeling?" John Davis asked, approaching discreetly. Chuck Gibson stopped his work and turned around, sweaty and clearly tired. "Mr. John, I didn't expect to see you here today. I come often. I like to observe how things are working." Chuck Gibson hesitated for a moment, then put the cleaning cloth aside. "Mr. John, can I talk to you about something?" "Of course. I was thinking about what happened last week and about how I treated you." John Davis nodded, encouraging him to continue. "My whole life I thought being rich meant having the right to mistreat poorer people. I thought my position gave me superiority over other human beings." Chuck Gibson sat in one of the lobby armchairs, and John Davis did the same. "These last few days they've been a lesson. I learned what it means to depend on the goodwill of other people. I learned what it means to be invisible, to be treated as if you're just a function, not a person." "And what else did you learn?" John Davis asked kindly. "I learned that there are employees here who have worked for years being humiliated daily, people like Bill, who put up with my mistreatment because they needed the job to support their family." Chuck Gibson lowered his head, visibly moved. "Mr. John, I want to apologize, not just for what I did to you, but for years of arrogance and disrespect. I don't know how I could have been so cruel." John Davis watched the man in front of him. Chuck Gibson was no longer the arrogant executive from a week ago. He was a human being who had gone through a profound, painful but necessary transformation. "Chuck Gibson, I accept your apologies. But more important than apologizing is to show the change through actions." "What kind of actions?" "Keep working with dignity. Treat your co-workers well. Use this experience to be a better person." At that moment, Jake approached, carrying some administrative reports. "Mr. John, excuse the interruption. I've brought the week's numbers for you to review." "Of course, Jake. How are things going?" "Interesting. Our TripAdvisor rating has gone up significantly. Guests are highly praising the quality of service and the friendly atmosphere of the hotel. John Davis smiled with satisfaction. And the employees? How are they adapting to the changes? Very well. In fact, I have a proposal to make. Jake looked at Chuck Gibson and then at John Davis. I've been observing Chuck Gibson this week. He's working with dedication, treating everyone with respect and showing a genuine change in attitude. Chuck Gibson looked up, curious as to where Jake was going with this. I'd like to propose that he be promoted to operations supervisor. It's an intermediate position where he can use his administrative experience, but always under supervision and with a focus on humanized service. The proposal took Chuck Gibson by surprise. He had resigned himself to remaining a bellboy for the rest of his life. Jake, John Davis said thoughtfully, why do you think he deserves this opportunity? Because true transformation deserves recognition, and because I believe that someone who has been through what he has been through can be an excellent supervisor. He knows what it's like to be at the bottom and will never want others to go through that. John Davis reflected for a few minutes, observing Chuck Gibson with attention. Chuck Gibson, what do you think of this proposal? Chuck Gibson remained silent for long seconds, clearly moved. Mr. John, if you give me this opportunity, I promise I will be a different supervisor. I will be the kind of boss I would have wanted to have when I was at the bottom. And what if one day the temptation to return to old habits arises? Then you can fire me immediately. But that's not going to happen. This week has taught me things I will never forget. John Davis looked at Jake, then at Chuck Gibson. All right, but with one condition. You will continue to work one morning a week as a bellboy, so that you never forget. John Davis's decision surprised everyone, but it demonstrated something fundamental about leadership. Sometimes giving a second chance is more powerful than any punishment. 2 months had passed since the transformation of the Ocean View Grand Hotel. The change was visible not only in the establishment's atmosphere, but in the very soul of the people who worked there. Chuck Gibson, now operations supervisor, arrived every day at 7 in the morning. On Tuesdays, he kept his commitment to work as a bellboy for the morning, carrying luggage and attending to guests' requests. It was his way of constantly remembering where he had fallen from and why he never wanted to return to arrogance. On that particular Tuesday, while helping an elderly family with their suitcases, Chuck Gibson was approached by a clearly irritated guest. Hey, why hasn't my room been cleaned yet? It's 9 in the morning. The man was tall, well-dressed, and spoke with the kind of arrogance Chuck Gibson knew well. After all, he himself had been like that for years. Sir, I will check the status of your room immediately. What is the number? 1205. And I want a solution now. Chuck Gibson went up to the 12th floor and found Mary, the maid responsible for that wing. Mary, the guest in 1205, is complaining about the cleaning. Mary, a 50-year-old woman with over 20 years of experience, sighed tiredly. Mr. Chuck Gibson, this guest is impossible. I've already cleaned the room twice, but he keeps complaining. He says it's not how he wants it. What kind of complaint? He wants the towels folded a specific way, the pillows placed at an exact angle, and the bathroom cleaned with specific products we don't even use at the hotel. Chuck Gibson recognized the pattern. It was the type of guest who used impossible complaints to humiliate employees and feel superior. Mary, don't worry. I will talk to him personally. Chuck Gibson went down to the ground floor and found the guest at the reception counter, making a scene with Natalie. This is unacceptable. I pay a fortune to stay at this hotel, and I'm treated this way. Excuse me. Chuck Gibson approached calmly. I am Chuck Gibson, operations supervisor. Can I help you? The man turned, looked Chuck Gibson up and down, and said with disdain, Finally, someone with authority. I want you to immediately fire the incompetent maid who is in charge of my room. 2 months ago, Chuck Gibson would probably have agreed to the request without questioning, just to satisfy an important guest. But not today. Sir, could you please explain exactly what the problem is with the cleaning? The problem is that these people don't know how to work. They can't even fold a towel correctly. I understand. And could you show me how you would like the towels to be folded? The question took the guest by surprise. He expected immediate agreement, not questions. That's not my problem. It's your obligation to know. Chuck Gibson remained calm and respectful in his tone. Sir, our team is highly qualified and follows international hotel standards. If you have any specific preferences, we will be happy to accommodate them. But I cannot fire an experienced employee for not guessing your personal preferences. The guest was visibly irritated with the response. Do you know who I am? I have enough money to buy this hotel. The phrase echoed in the lobby, and Chuck Gibson felt a pang of recognition. How many times had he himself used similar arguments to intimidate people? "Sir, I respect your financial position, but here all people are treated with dignity, both guests and employees. I can resolve your room issue, but I will not harm a competent employee." The man was left speechless. He was clearly not used to his demands being questioned. "This is ridiculous. I'll talk to the manager." "Of course, sir. The manager, Jake Miller, will be available in an hour. In the meantime, may I personally go up to your room and ensure everything is to your liking?" Reluctantly, the guest agreed. Chuck Gibson went up with him to room 1205, carefully examined the cleaning, and confirmed it was impeccable. "Sir, the room is clean according to our professional standards. If you have specific preferences for organization, I can ask the team to note them for future stays." The guest realized he wouldn't succeed in humiliating anyone in this situation, and finally accepted the offered conditions. Later, Mary sought out Chuck Gibson. "Mr. Chuck Gibson, thank you for not hurting me with that difficult guest. Mary, you have worked here for 20 years with dedication. I will not allow anyone to disrespect you for a whim." But the true test of Chuck Gibson's transformation was yet to come, when an unexpected event would definitively test his new character. It was a busy Friday at the Ocean View Grand Hotel when a group of businessmen arrived for a corporate event. Among them was Edward Shaw, an old colleague of Chuck Gibson's from the days when they both worked at another luxury hotel in Miami. Edward now held the position of director of operations at a large hotel chain and had not seen Chuck Gibson in over 2 years. When he recognized him wearing a supervisor's uniform, he couldn't hide his astonishment. "Chuck Gibson, my God, what are you doing here in that position?" The question echoed in the lobby, attracting curious glances. Chuck Gibson felt his face get hot, but he maintained his composure. "Hello, Edward. I work here as operations supervisor." "Supervisor?" Edward couldn't hide a sarcastic smile. "My friend, you were a general manager. What happened? Did you get demoted?" The situation was embarrassing. Other businessmen in the group began to pay attention to the conversation, and the hotel employees watched from a distance. "It's a long story, Edward." "Wow, what a fall!" "From general manager to supervisor, you must have gotten into some serious trouble." Chuck Gibson took a deep breath. 2 months ago, he would have lied, invented any excuse to preserve his ego. But something fundamental had changed inside him. "Actually, Edward, I was fired from the manager position for mistreating people. Deservedly fired." The brutal honesty of the answer took Edward by surprise. "What do you mean, mistreating people?" "I discriminated against people based on their appearance. I was arrogant with employees, disrespectful to those I considered inferior, until the day I humiliated the hotel owner himself because he was dressed simply." Edward's eyes widened. "You did what?" "Exactly what you heard. I judged the owner by his appearance, treated him like a beggar, and threw his documents in the trash without even looking." The businessmen nearby began to pay attention to the conversation. The story was so unusual that it aroused curiosity. "And the guy fired you?" "He fired me and demoted me to bellboy for a week, so I could learn firsthand what it meant to be humiliated." Edward let out a disbelieving laugh. "What a situation! And you accepted that humiliation?" "It wasn't humiliation, Edward, it was education." The answer made Edward stop laughing. "How so?" Chuck Gibson looked around the lobby, at Natalie respectfully serving all the guests, at Bill greeting people kindly, at Mary cleaning with the same care regardless of who the guest was. "I learned that your position doesn't give you the right to mistreat anyone. I learned that all honest work has dignity. I learned that respect has nothing to do with hierarchical position. My friend, you've really changed. Before you were..." "I was an arrogant jerk," Chuck Gibson completed without hesitation. "I was the kind of person who mistreated waiters in restaurants, who ignored maids in the hallways, who believed that money gave me moral superiority." Edward was silent for a few seconds, processing his old colleague's transformation. "And do you feel good in that lesser position?" "Edward, my position isn't lesser, it's different, and I feel good doing an honest job, treating people with dignity and building something positive." At that moment, Jake approached the group. "Excuse me, gentlemen, I'm Jake Miller, general manager. How can I help you?" Edward looked from Chuck Gibson to Jake, clearly confused by the hierarchical dynamic. "You're the manager, but you look so young." Jake smiled. "I'm 24, sir. I was promoted by the owner for demonstrating human values consistent with the hotel's philosophy." Chuck Gibson stepped forward. "Edward, Jake is the best manager this hotel has ever had. He leads with empathy, treats everyone with respect, and has transformed this place into an environment where people like to work. Chuck Gibson's statement surprised Edward even more. Are you praising your younger boss? I'm praising an exceptional leader. Age doesn't determine leadership ability, Edward. Character does. But the conversation was not yet over. Edward was about to make a proposal that would definitively test Chuck Gibson's new values. Edward couldn't fully comprehend Chuck Gibson's transformation. After the group of businessmen settled into their rooms, he returned to the lobby for a private conversation with his old colleague. Chuck, can I talk to you alone? Of course, Edward. They headed to a reserved area of the lobby, away from curious ears. My friend, I don't understand. You were always ambitious. You always wanted to grow in your career. How can you be satisfied being a supervisor? Chuck Gibson settled into the armchair, thoughtful. Edward, have you ever stopped to think about what growing in a career means? For years I thought growing meant earning more money and having more power over other people. And doesn't it? I discovered that it means growing as a person. It means contributing positively to the lives of other people. It means leaving the world a little better than it was when we arrived. Edward shook his head, still skeptical. All right, but let's be practical. I have a proposal for you. Chuck Gibson raised his eyebrows, curious. Our chain is expanding. We're going to open a new hotel in San Diego, 5-star international standard. I need a competent general manager. The proposal took Chuck Gibson by surprise. You're offering me a general manager position? Exactly. Starting salary of $15,000, profit sharing, premium health plan, company car. What do you think? Chuck Gibson was silent for long minutes. $15,000 was 3 times what he earned as a supervisor at the Ocean View Grand Hotel. It's a generous proposal, Edward. So, do you accept? Can I ask why you're offering it to me? Edward leaned forward, confidential. Because, despite all these changes, you're still the Chuck Gibson I knew. Competent, determined, who knows how to make things work. This humanization phase will pass, and you'll go back to being what you always were, an excellent administrator. Edward's response revealed that he had completely misunderstood Chuck Gibson's transformation. Edward, do you think this is a phase, some kind of temporary depression? My friend, it's obvious you were humiliated, your ego was bruised, and now you're with this treat everyone well thing to compensate. But that passes. Deep down, you're still the same. Chuck Gibson smiled sadly. You're wrong, Edward. It's not a phase. It's who I truly am now. Oh, don't be dramatic. Accept the proposal. In San Diego, you can go back to being who you always were. No one knows this story. The offer was tempting. Chuck Gibson could start over in another state with an excellent salary and all the authority of a general manager. He could pretend the last 2 months never happened. I need to think about it, Edward. There's nothing to think about. It's a unique opportunity. Either you accept it now or I offer it to another candidate. Chuck Gibson looked around the lobby of the Ocean View Grand Hotel. He saw Mary organizing flower arrangements with the same care as always. He saw Bill greeting a family with small children, patiently helping with their luggage. He saw Natalie attending to an elderly couple with genuine kindness. 2 weeks ago, these same people were just employees to him. Now they were colleagues, they were people he respected and who respected him back. Edward, thank you for the proposal, but I'm going to decline. Edward was left speechless. What do you mean, decline? My friend, are you turning down $15,000 a month to keep earning $5,000 as a supervisor? I'm turning down going back to being who I was. I'm turning down betraying the people who trusted in my change. This is crazy, Chuck. Maybe it is, but it's the right kind of crazy. Edward stood up, visibly irritated. All right then, stay in your little life as a supervisor, but don't come crying to me when you regret it. After Edward walked away, Chuck Gibson remained seated, reflecting on the choice he had just made. Jake, who had observed part of the conversation from a distance, approached. Everything okay, Chuck Gibson? Everything's great, Jake. In fact, everything's wonderful. Can I ask what you talked about? Chuck Gibson told him about the proposal and his decision to turn it down. Are you sure? It was a good financial opportunity. Jake, I learned that there are things more valuable than money. One of them is being able to look at myself in the mirror and like the person looking back at me. But the true reward for Chuck Gibson's choice would come in a way he could never have imagined. The following Monday after Edward's visit, John Davis appeared at the hotel earlier than usual. He found Chuck Gibson organizing the work schedule of the operational employees. Good morning, Chuck Gibson. Can we talk? Of course, Mr. John, always at your disposal. They headed to a reserved corner of the restaurant, which had not yet opened for guests. I heard you received an interesting job proposal last week. Chuck Gibson was surprised. How had John Davis found out? Yes, Mr. John, an old colleague offered me a general manager position in San Diego. And I turned it down. John Davis nodded slowly. May I ask why? Chuck Gibson took a deep breath before answering. Because accepting it would be betraying everything I've learned here. It would be going back to being who I was before, and I no longer want to be that person, even knowing that the salary would be 3 times higher. Mr. John, you taught me that there are things more valuable than money. I learned that I'd rather earn less and sleep peacefully than earn more and despise who I am. John Davis watched Chuck Gibson with attention. He saw a sincerity in his eyes that didn't exist 3 months ago. Chuck Gibson, I want to tell you something. I knew about your colleague's proposal even before he made it to you. How? Edward Shaw sought me out before he talked to you. He wanted to know about your current situation and if I would recommend you for the position. Chuck Gibson's eyes widened. And what did you tell him? I told him that you had gone through a genuine transformation, but that the decision to accept or not accept the proposal would be a definitive test of your character. A test? John Davis smiled. Yes, Chuck Gibson. A test. And you passed it with flying colors. They were silent for a few minutes, observing the morning movement of the hotel through the restaurant windows. Mr. John, can I ask you a question? Of course. Why did you give me a second chance? I treated you terribly. I deserve to have been fired, and that's it. John Davis leaned forward, adopting a more intimate tone. Chuck Gibson, I already told you that I grew up in the Flats neighborhood. What I didn't tell you is that my transformation was only possible because someone gave me a second chance. How? When I was 22, I worked as a mason's assistant. One day, I stole money from my boss. Not a lot, just enough to buy medicine for my mother who was sick. Chuck Gibson listened with full attention. I got caught. The boss could have sent me to jail, ruined my life forever. But he did something different. What? He called me in for a conversation just like I'm doing with you now. He said I had potential, but I was making bad decisions. He offered me a second chance. John Davis paused, lost in memories. That man became my mentor. He taught me about construction, about administration, about how to treat people. More importantly, he taught me that mistakes don't define who we are, but how we react to them does. And what happened to him? He passed away 5 years ago. But before he died, he made me promise that I would do for others what he did for me. Give second chances to people who truly wanted to change. Chuck Gibson felt his eyes fill with tears. Is that why you gave me this opportunity? Exactly. And that's why I have a new proposal for you. Chuck Gibson straightened up in his chair. I am expanding my businesses. I'm going to open a new hotel in Houston with the same humanized philosophy we've implemented here. I need someone to be the general manager. Chuck Gibson's heart raced. Someone who understands that leadership is not about power, but about service. Someone who has already learned firsthand what it means to be humiliated, and who never wants to do that to other people again. Mr. John, someone who, when tested with a tempting proposal, chose integrity over easy money. Chuck Gibson couldn't speak. Emotion had completely overcome him. The starting salary will be $12,000, with profit sharing based not only on financial numbers, but on employee and guest satisfaction. Do you accept? Chuck Gibson's response would definitively seal his transformation and open a new chapter in his life. Chuck Gibson was silent for long minutes, processing the magnitude of the proposal. Tears ran freely down his face, and he made no effort to hide them. Mr. John, he finally said with a broken voice, I don't know if I deserve this trust. No one deserves an opportunity, Chuck Gibson. Opportunities are earned through actions, and your actions in recent months have shown who you really are now. Chuck Gibson stood up from the chair, walked to the window, and watched the movement of Miami Beach. Families walked on the sand, street vendors offered their products, children played in the waves. All that simple and genuine life he had learned to value. I accept, he said, turning back to John Davis, but with one condition. John Davis smiled, curious. What condition? I want every employee at the new hotel to go through the same training I went through here. I want them to understand that there is no superior or inferior work, only honest work. I completely agree. And I want to implement a policy where every manager, supervisor, and department head works at least once a month in operational roles, so they never forget what it's like to be at the bottom. John Davis stood up and extended his hand to Chuck Gibson. Chuck Gibson, you are no longer the person who humiliated me 3 months ago. You are exactly the type of leader the world needs. They shook hands warmly, and at that moment, Jake appeared at the restaurant entrance. Excuse the interruption, but I thought you'd like to know. We just received a review from a guest who stayed here last week. What kind of review? John Davis asked. He wrote on TripAdvisor that he had never seen a hotel where employees treated each other with so much mutual respect. He said the atmosphere was contagious and that he plans to always return. Chuck Gibson smiled. Do you know what that means, Jake? It means that when we treat people well, it's reflected in everything. In the service, in the quality of the work, in the guest's experience. Exactly, John Davis agreed. And this is just the beginning. In the following months, the story of the Ocean View Grand Hotel's transformation spread throughout Miami. Other hotels began to implement similar policies of respect and dignity. Hospitality schools started to use the case as an example in their humanized management classes. Chuck Gibson moved to Houston, where he applied everything he had learned. The new hotel quickly became a benchmark, not only for service quality, but for a healthy and respectful work environment. Natalie was promoted to assistant manager at the Ocean View Grand Hotel, specializing in humanized service training. Bill became a reception supervisor, using his experience to teach new employees about the importance of every person who crosses the hotel's door. Mary, the maid, was invited to be a coordinator for operational training, teaching not only cleaning techniques, but also principles of dignity and work. Jake continued as general manager, developing a leadership style that became a case study in universities. Under his management, the hotel never had a single firing due to interpersonal conflicts. And John Davis? He continued to visit his hotels dressed simply, observing, learning, and whenever necessary, reminding everyone that true wealth is not in what we possess, but in how we treat the people around us. 2 years later, on a sunny Sunday morning, John Davis was walking along the Miami boardwalk when he found a poorly dressed man being mistreated by a security guard from another luxury hotel. He smiled, adjusted his simple shirt and his old leather bag, and walked toward the commotion. After all, some lessons need to be taught more than once, and some transformations need to spread throughout the world, one person at a time.